Hello, fellow Shakespeare readers. I'm Dr. Mark Scott, and I teach Shakespeare at the University of Arkansas in Fayetteville. I'm here today to share some thoughts with you about a little play called Hamlet. Written sometime between 1599 and 1601, Hamlet is undoubtedly Shakespeare's most famous play. So much so that if you've heard of Shakespeare, you've probably heard of Hamlet too. The play has been performed across the globe in more than 75 different languages, and it has even been produced in other worlds. In 2010, astronauts aboard the International Space Station staged, or rather floated, a reading of Hamlet to celebrate Shakespeare's birthday. During the COVID pandemic lockdowns, meanwhile, players of Grand Theft Auto Online staged their own version of the play in the virtual world, as immortalized in the 2024 documentary film Grand Theft Hamlet. In other words, Hamlet has been an almost incomparably important and influential work of literature for Western, indeed global, culture. But if all this feels a little bit intimidating, take a step back and remember that after all is said and done, Hamlet is just another play, just as open to questioning, examination, and critique as any other piece of writing. And for what it's worth, not everyone agrees that it's even all that good. The 18th century French writer Voltaire, while conceding that the play contains the odd stroke of genius, concluded that overall Hamlet is a gross and barbarous piece that would never be borne by the lowest rabble in France and demonstrated the imagination of a drunken savage. Now, whatever Shakespeare was drinking while he was writing Hamlet, I must disagree with Voltaire and insist that the play is, at least in my opinion, magnificent. But it certainly contains its fair share of barbarity and savagery. Take poor Hamlet's predicament. At the start of the play, the Prince of Denmark is grieving the death of his father, old King Hamlet. Although old Hamlet has barely been dead 2 months, his widow, and Hamlet's mother, Gertrude, has already married his brother and Hamlet's uncle, the new King Claudius. Everyone, apart from Hamlet, seems perfectly happy with all of this. Gertrude insists that since all that lives must die, passing through nature to eternity, the death of old Hamlet is common, nothing out of the ordinary. Why, then, she asks her son, seems it so particular with thee? Hamlet's response immediately establishes some of the play's key thematic concerns. Seems, madam? Nay, it is. I know not seems. 'Tis not alone my inky cloak, good mother, nor customary suits of solemn black, nor windy suspiration of forced breath, no, nor the fruitful river in the eye, nor the dejected haviour of the visage, together with all forms, moods, shapes of grief that can denote me truly. These indeed seem, for these are actions that a man might play. But I have that within which passes show, these but the trappings and the suits of woe. That within which passes show. Readers have been drawn to Hamlet precisely because the play is so concerned with exploring the inner workings of the mind, and in its protagonist we see a vivid portrait of psychological turmoil. A key feature of Shakespeare's staging of Hamlet's interiority is the use of soliloquy. A soliloquy is a speech delivered by a character alone on stage. The usual inference is that since no other character is present, the speaker is not performing for anyone, and so we are granted access to their truest inner thoughts. Of course, as the speech I just quoted suggests, with its emphasis on the distinction between seeming and being, the play calls into question the very stability of the truth-falsehood binary. The possibility of there being a mismatch between outer appearance and inner reality haunts Hamlet, as he himself realizes later in the play, one may smile and be a villain. But I risk losing the plot. As if all of this weren't enough to keep Hamlet and his therapist busy, by the end of Act 1, the Danish prince has encountered a ghost who, claiming to be the spirit of his dead father, says that he was actually murdered by Claudius, who poured poison in his ear while he was taking his afternoon nap. Now, keep this method of murder in mind while reading the play. Shakespeare incessantly refers to the eyes and ears of his characters, and his Denmark is a surveillance state, with everybody constantly spying and eavesdropping on those around them. But there's also a sense in which, just as Claudius poisons old Hamlet through the ear, the ghost account metaphorically infects Hamlet's hearing, with deathly consequences. I say this because of what this ghost demands of his son, to revenge his foul and most unnatural murder. With this pivotal line, Shakespeare indicates that his play is not just a tragedy, but specifically a revenge tragedy. This genre of play, particularly popular in the Elizabethan and Jacobean eras, centered on an individual's quest for vengeance, usually demanded by a murdered relative or lover, and often featured ghosts, scenes of madness, and gory violence. By the end of these plays, everybody is dead, save a sad witness or two who might live to tell the tale. Morally speaking, revenge was a vexed issue for Shakespeare and his contemporaries. From classical civilization, they had inherited the ancient Roman honor code, which fully endorsed personal revenge-taking as a mode of justice. But Shakespeare lived in a deeply Christian society, and the Christian position on revenge was more than a little confusing. On the one hand, the Old Testament adage, an eye for an eye, seemingly endorses a revenge ethos, and in God himself we find the ideal model of a violent revenger. And yet, crucially, as stated elsewhere in Scripture, vengeance is mine, says the Lord. And so for an individual human to take on the mantle of revenger is a potentially sacrilegious appropriation of divine authority. Christ, for his part, rejected revenge entirely, famously instructing his followers, "Whosoever shall smite thee on thy right cheek, turn to him the other also." Now, most protagonists of revenge tragedies don't let such moral and theological complexities weigh them down, but what sets Hamlet apart, at least for most of Shakespeare's play, is that he does. Early on, before meeting the ghost and embarking on his revenge mission, Hamlet, in his grief, contemplates suicide during his first soliloquy, but ultimately rejects this desperate course of action because, as he puts it, God has fixed his canon against self-slaughter. Later, in his most famous soliloquy, the one that begins "to be or not to be," Hamlet continues to worry about the spiritual consequences that his actions in this life will have in the next. Who would fardels bear, he asks himself, fardels are burdens, but that the dread of something after death, the undiscovered country, from whose bourne no traveller returns, puzzles the will, and makes us rather bear those ills than fly to others we know not of. Traditionally, critics have viewed Hamlet as the supreme procrastinator. All this dilly-dallying about moral and spiritual anxieties supposedly gets in the way of him manning up and taking action. Hamlet himself voices this view, worrying that conscience does make cowards of us all, and thus the native hue of resolution is sicklied o'er with the pale cast of thought. But are conscience and thought really such bad things? In order to delay his revenge, think some more, and gain what proof he can of Claudius's guilt, Hamlet resolves to put on an antic disposition. In other words, to pretend to be mad, so as to avoid arousing Claudius's animosity. This has always seemed like a pretty dumb plan to me, and in any case, it doesn't work. During a particularly heated conversation with his mother, Gertrude, Hamlet hears something rustling behind a curtain and thrusts his sword through it, killing Claudius's chief advisor and spy, Polonius. Claudius immediately has Hamlet shipped off to England to try and avoid a scandal, but before leaving, the prince delivers one final soliloquy, at the end of which he is resolved. "Oh, from this time forth, my thoughts be bloody or be nothing worth." And Hamlet is true to his word. When he returns to Denmark in Act 5, no more soliloquies, no more thinking, just cold, chaotic murder. I say chaotic because along with Claudius and Hamlet, by the end of the play, Polonius, his children Laertes and Ophelia, Gertrude, and Hamlet's university friends Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are all dead, and with no one left to rule Denmark, the Norwegian Prince Fortinbras swoops in and steals the crown. Hamlet's dying words, "The rest is silence," are a far cry from his earlier musings on the mysteries of the undiscovered country. And revenge has done what revenge does, by making the revenger the same kind of violent criminal they were originally the victim of. Revenge is ultimately, it seems, a dish best left in the kitchen. Turn the other cheek, indeed. There's so much that we haven't had the chance to discuss yet. The play within the play, the gravedigger scene, there's even an episode involving some pirates. But it would be remiss if I didn't say a word or two about Polonius's daughter Ophelia. Hamlet is, quite simply, a complete jerk to Ophelia. And he's not alone. From what we can piece together, Hamlet and Ophelia have in the past been romantically involved, but things between them have soured before the start of the play. However, Hamlet realizes that Ophelia might be useful to him in his mission and encourages others, led by the foolish Polonius, to believe that the source of his supposedly pretend madness is Ophelia's rejection of him. Everyone around Ophelia simply uses her as a pawn in their power games, from her father Polonius and her brother Laertes to Hamlet and even Gertrude. The men in Ophelia's life seem particularly concerned with the policing of her sexuality. Laertes warns his sister not to open her chaste treasure to Hamlet, but rather, "Fear it, Ophelia, fear it, my dear sister." The "it" to which Laertes is referring is, of course, sex. Hamlet, meanwhile, projecting his outrage at his mother's hasty remarriage onto all women, attacks Ophelia with a sexist diatribe in which he accuses her of being no more than a breeder of sinners. "Get thee to a nunnery," he shouts at her again and again. When Hamlet accidentally kills her father behind the curtain, it's one ordeal too many for Ophelia to bear, and she runs mad, finally drowning in a catastrophe that most of the other characters view as suicide. Shakespeare's Ophelia has been a figure of fascination for other artists across the centuries. Most recently, Taylor Swift revisited and rewrote her story in The Fate of Ophelia. It's a great song, and it's so cool to see Swift engaging with Shakespeare, but I fear that her lyrics rather miss the point. Swift imagines herself as having been saved from the fate of Ophelia by Travis Kelce. "You dug me out of my grave and saved my heart from the fate of Ophelia." But what is the fate of Ophelia? For Swift, it seems that she simply didn't meet the right guy, that it all could have been so very different if only a better Prince Charming had come along on his white steed to rescue her. I would argue that the fate of Ophelia is something much darker and more disturbing. That in Shakespeare's play, where something is rotten in the state of Denmark, relations between men and women are so deeply poisoned, patriarchal power so stiflingly oppressive, that life in an all-female nunnery, or even death, are better options for a woman like Ophelia than heterosexual romance. In such a bleak world, the very act of rescuing Ophelia, sat alone in her tower, as Swift sings, would merely function as a further reinforcement of heterosexist control and violence. If you're looking for a song about Ophelia that's a bit more faithful to Shakespeare's text, check out the fourth verse of Bob Dylan's 1965 masterpiece, Desolation Row. Now, excuse me while I enter the witness protection program before a bunch of angry Swifties descend on Kimpole Hall. I hope you enjoy reading this weird and wonderful play as much as I do.